My father stood before the jury, waving a bank statement like the final nail in my coffin. He called me a parasite who vanished for 10 years, only returning to drain money from my dead mother. The courtroom had silently convicted me before I could speak. Yet, the only person not rushing to judgment was the judge sitting high above us. My father had no idea he had picked the exact wrong man to lie to. My name is Stella Rivera. I am 38 years old. I sit motionless in the suffocating, wood-paneled civil courtroom of Belmere County. The air in here is stagnant, smelling faintly of cheap lemon polish, old paper, and damp wool. But beneath those institutional odors is the sharp, undeniable scent of a community's quiet judgment. On the witness stand sits my father, Gabriel Rivera. His large, weathered hand rests on a worn leather Bible as he swears to tell the whole truth, a promise he shatters the moment he opens his mouth. With a voice trembling with perfectly calibrated sorrow, he tells the court that I have not worked a respectable day in my adult life. He looks directly at the jury, his eyes shining with unshed tears, and states that I am a parasite. He calls me a daughter who vanished for over 10 years, only to return and drain the life savings of the woman who gave me birth. My father describes me as a runaway. He tells a story of a selfish, arrogant girl who fled the honest, hard-working life of our small town to chase arrogant fantasies in the city. According to him, I survive on sweet talk, deceit, and a rotating list of corporate mailing addresses that lead nowhere but empty rooms and voicemail boxes. He paints a picture of a relentless grifter. As he speaks, he lifts his right arm. Clutched in his thick, calloused fingers is a heavy bundle of bank records. He waves the papers high in the air for everyone to see. The thick parchment rustles, a harsh sound designed to mimic the rustle of stolen cash. He points an accusatory finger at the pages, transforming perfectly legal, meticulously documented financial transfers into a cruel, calculated theft. He tells them I stole tens of thousands of dollars. Every syllable he utters is a deliberate strike, designed to make me look like a vulture circling a sickbed, picking the bones of a dying woman clean. Behind me, in the gallery's second row, sits my younger sister, Tessa Rivera. I do not need to turn my head to feel the suffocating weight of her performance. When I entered the courtroom this morning, I immediately noted her costume. She wore a faded beige sweater and sensible, scuffed flat shoes. She wore absolutely no makeup, allowing the natural dark circles under her eyes to do the heavy emotional lifting for her. Her posture was deliberately slumped, projecting the utter exhaustion of a lifelong martyr. Tessa is playing the role of the loyal, devastated child to absolute perfection. She is the daughter who stayed behind. She is the one who allegedly held our mother's hand, administered the bitter medication, and weathered the grueling, sleepless nights, only to be stabbed in the back by the prodigal sister. She weeps silently at all the right intervals, dabbing her eyes with a crumpled white tissue whenever my father's voice strategically catches in his throat. Lowell Pike, the plaintiff's attorney, paces the floor between the witness stand and the jury box. Lowell is a theatrical, sharply dressed man who knows exactly how to manipulate a rural audience. He stops pacing and leans casually against the wooden rail, addressing the jurors as if they are old friends sharing a dark secret over a backyard fence. Lowell lowers his voice to a grave, resonant baritone. He tells them that Stella Rivera leaves no public footprint. He emphasizes the word zero, drawing it out to make it sound sinister. He lists the things I supposedly lack. I have no prominent career profile that anyone can search on the internet. I have no social media pages showing a normal, happy life with friends and dogs and vacations. I have no digital network, no photographs of company picnics, no public history of steady employment. Lowell shakes his head in feigned, sorrowful disbelief. He tells the room that by the traditional, honest standards of this town, I do not possess a real life. I am a shadow. I am a ghost who only materialized in the physical world when there was a lucrative estate to be liquidated. The silence in the room is heavy, thick, and deafening. Every ounce of gravity in this space pulls entirely toward Gabriel. This is his territory. He is not just a grieving widower sitting on a witness stand. He is a towering pillar of Belmere. He is the head contractor who poured the concrete foundation for the very courthouse we are sitting in. He is the wealthy, generous benefactor who single-handedly funded the new slate roof for the First Baptist Church. He is a former city councilman who has glad-handed every business owner within a 50-mile radius. I look over at the jury box. There are 12 faces looking back, and my father knows almost all of them intimately. He has sponsored the youth baseball team of the woman sitting in seat 4. He went deer hunting with the older brother of the man in seat 7. He is a permanent, beloved fixture of their world. They nod subtly, almost unconsciously, as he speaks his lies. Their arms are crossed tightly against their chests in a defensive posture against me. I can feel their collective disdain radiating across the room. They have made up their minds before the first piece of actual evidence has even been submitted. They look at me with a cold hostility usually reserved for violent criminals. I do not object. I do not shake my head in frantic denial. I sit with my spine perfectly straight, pressed against the hard back of the wooden chair. My hands are folded neatly and loosely in my lap. I reach out with my right hand and pick up the small plastic cup of water resting on the defense table. I take a slow, deliberate sip. The water is lukewarm and carries a sharp, metallic taste, exactly like old copper pennies. I swallow it slowly and lower the cup, placing it back on the cardboard coaster without making a single sound. I am simply observing. I watch the way my father breathes. I note the exact moments he pauses to let a particularly hurtful accusation linger in the silent air. I see how his attorney guides him through the testimony with practiced, effortless ease. It is a flawlessly choreographed dance. They have rehearsed this false narrative until it is entirely frictionless. In the first 60 seconds of this trial, the absolute chilling truth of the situation becomes crystal clear to me. This proceeding is not about recovering missing family funds. It is not about a tragic misunderstanding over a complicated will. It is a public execution. It is a meticulously planned honor killing of my reputation, set in motion many months before my mother even took her final, rattling breath. Gabriel is using the legal system to construct a massive, unassailable monument to his own victimization. He wants to ensure that my name becomes permanently synonymous with greed and betrayal in the only town I ever called home. He wants to erase my legitimacy. Yet, as I sit under the crushing, suffocating weight of their collective hatred, my pulse remains entirely steady. My breathing is deep and even. I am not panicking. The public humiliation is incredibly heavy, specifically designed to break my spirit, to make me stand up and scream in my own desperate defense. They want me to lose control, thereby proving their point that I am unstable, erratic, and guilty, but I refuse to give them that satisfaction. I am coldly and methodically absorbing every lie, every exaggerated sigh, every piece of fake evidence they lay out on the oak table. My silence is not a surrender. It is a calculated restraint. I watch my father's confident, aggressive posture on the stand, and a quiet, dark certainty settles deep in my chest. He thinks he has delivered the killing blow. He thinks the battle is already over and he has won. But I know the hidden architecture of this legal trap far better than he ever could. I know that the hardest, most devastating strike has not yet been thrown. I am simply waiting for the exact right moment to let him completely destroy himself. To truly understand the venom in my father's voice today, you have to peel back the layers of the family he built. Growing up in the Rivera household meant living under a dictatorship of affection. Gabriel was the sole architect of our reality, and he alone decided who was worthy of being loved and who was merely destined to be used. In his world, there was no unconditional support. Love was a highly volatile currency, dispensed only when it earned him a direct, tangible return on his investment. From a very young age, I was the quiet, observant one. I poured all my energy into working relentlessly. I was a dedicated student, spending countless hours in the local library, burying myself in complex subjects that my father could not begin to understand. I brought home thick envelopes containing academic awards, state-level debate trophies, and substantial scholarship offers. But to Gabriel, those quiet, intellectual victories were entirely worthless. He was a man built of concrete, calluses, and local networking. He respected absolutely nothing that could not be constructed with a hammer or leveraged over a cold beer at the town diner. My achievements did not offer him any public glory. He could not brag about my advanced calculus scores to his hunting buddies or use my science fair ribbons to secure a municipal contracting bid. Because my success did not cast a flattering spotlight directly onto his own face, he treated it as an annoying distraction. My sister, Tessa, who is 5 years my junior, figured out the rules of this rigged domestic game very early on. She realized that the easiest, safest way to survive Gabriel's demanding orbit was to become a permanent, validating satellite. While I plotted my escape to a larger world, Tessa aggressively rooted herself in Belmere. She made sure she was highly visible at every family gathering, every Sunday church service, and every town barbecue. She learned exactly how to please him. She knew when to hand him his tools, when to laugh at his crude, repetitive jokes, and how to flawlessly perform the role of the devoted, uncomplicated child. She traded any chance of true independence for a comfortable, subsidized existence. Tessa became the designated good daughter not by achieving anything remarkable of her own, but simply by never, ever challenging his absolute authority. When I finally packed my bags and moved hundreds of miles away to build a specialized career in the city, Gabriel took my departure as an unforgivable personal insult. In his mind, leaving his geographic domain was an act of profound treason. Since he could no longer dictate my daily actions, he decided to completely control my ghost. He began a slow, methodical campaign to rewrite my identity within the town limits. Whenever a neighbor or a fellow churchgoer asked how his eldest daughter was doing, he would adopt a mask of deep, paternal sorrow. He would sigh heavily and tell them that I was having a very hard time fitting in. He planted toxic seeds of doubt everywhere he went, casually mentioning to the local hardware store owner or his golf partners that I always thought I was somehow better than everyone else. Because I was working 80-hour weeks in a demanding corporate environment and rarely had the time to travel back for Sunday dinners, my physical absence became his greatest weapon. He weaponized my silence, slowly transforming my lack of presence into concrete proof of my supposed failure, arrogance, and isolation. The true terrifying depth of his psychological campaign did not fully register with me until the afternoon following my mother's funeral. After we laid her to rest in the damp earth, I walked back into our old childhood home on Elm Street. I needed a few moments of quiet away from the suffocating crowd of whispering neighbors and the heavy scent of funeral casseroles. I walked down the main hallway, a narrow, dimly lit corridor where my mother had always proudly displayed the milestones of our family. I stopped dead in my tracks. The wall was unnervingly bare. Every single trace of my existence had been methodically and completely stripped away. My high school graduation portrait was gone. The heavy framed university diploma I had proudly mailed to them over a decade ago was missing. Even the small silver academic medals that used to hang by the thermostat had vanished. In their place were 3 framed pictures of Tessa's new golden retriever, a generic painting of a red barn, and stark, empty patches of faded floral wallpaper. There was a distinct, clean rectangular shadow exactly where my degree used to hang. The nail hole had been clumsily filled with cheap white putty. My father had literally erased me from the family history. He had torn my existence out of the house, just like a bitter author tearing a highly unsatisfactory chapter out of a manuscript. It was not a hasty decision made in a moment of fresh grief. It was a calculated, cold-blooded domestic cleansing. He made sure the rest of Belmere received the newly updated script. In the agonizing days following the funeral, he quietly and efficiently sent signals to everyone who mattered. He cornered the local pastor, the bank teller, and the diner waitresses, whispering that I had only bothered to return home because I smelled an inheritance check waiting to be cut, and Tessa let him do it. She never directly invented the massive, cruel lies herself, but she happily harvested the lucrative fruits of his ongoing slander. Because she was playing the role of the traumatized, loyal child left behind, she was heavily rewarded. I noticed the brand new, expensive mid-sized vehicle parked in her driveway. I saw the high-end appliances being installed in her newly renovated kitchen. I knew perfectly well that her notoriously maxed-out credit cards were magically being paid off on time. She bought her financial security and her shining reputation with her absolute silence. If I was successfully painted as the cold, calculating villain, then Tessa's passive complicity made her look entirely innocent and pure by comparison. Standing in that stripped, empty hallway months ago, tracing the faint outline of where my life used to hang, I finally understood the dark core of this entire conflict. This massive legal circus, the shocking accusations of theft, the brutal character assassination playing out in this courtroom today, absolutely none of it is actually about recovering my mother's assets. The money is just a convenient excuse. Gabriel Rivera is a man who requires absolute, unquestioned dominion over his environment. The true underlying issue is that he simply cannot tolerate the fact that I became highly successful in a complex, sophisticated world that he can neither understand nor control. He cannot stand the reality that I do not need his financial support, his conditional approval, or his small-town influence to survive. Since he could not reach up and drag my professional life down, he decided to drag my moral character through the dirt of our hometown. That is the bitter, unyielding realization that anchors my soul to this hard wooden chair right now. Long before the plaintiff's attorney filed the very first legal motion, long before the aggressive subpoenas were issued and the jury was seated, my father had already won the trial in the collective mind of this community. He spent years meticulously laying the groundwork, poisoning the communal well so thoroughly that no one sitting in that jury box would ever inherently believe a single word I said. They do not see a grieving daughter defending her honor. They see the arrogant, greedy, soulless failure that Gabriel invented over a decade of Sunday conversations. Recognizing this complete and utter social defeat is exactly why I made a vow to myself before walking through those double oak doors this morning. I will not fight him with emotion. Shedding tears would instantly be framed by his lawyer as the manipulative crying of a guilty woman. Flashing my genuine anger would be framed as the erratic instability of a broken daughter. Pleading for their understanding would only feed my father's massive, insatiable ego. He desperately wants a dramatic, weeping breakdown. He wants to watch me beg for the town's forgiveness on the public stage he built. Instead, I'm going to starve him of the drama he craves. I will give him absolutely nothing but cold, terrifying, undeniable facts. My mother, Marian Rivera, did not slip away quietly in the night. Her departure was a grueling, agonizingly slow erosion that spanned the final 3 years of her life. It was a brutal cascade of prolonged outpatient treatments, brutally expensive prescription medications, and terrifying periods of cognitive fog. There were days when she could sharply recall the exact floral pattern of her childhood bedroom wallpaper, down to the tiny yellow daisies near the baseboards. Then there were the other, much darker days when she looked at the kitchen table and could not remember what a simple silver fork was used for. The physical toll of her failing organs was devastating, but the indignity of losing her autonomy, of being treated like a ghost in her own living room, was what truly broke her spirit. Gabriel despised the reality of her illness. More specifically, he despised how her illness reflected upon his carefully curated image. He hated the intrusion of unfamiliar doctors asking probing, uncomfortable questions about her daily routine. He loathed the idea of visiting nurses walking through his heavy oak front door with their clinical clipboards and their sharp, assessing eyes. To my father, a house full of medical professionals was a glaring neon sign broadcasting his own inability to manage his domestic domain. It made him look like a helpless, aging husband rather than the undisputed, powerful patriarch of Belmere. Because his public ego was vastly more important than his wife's private comfort, he continually dragged his feet on hiring specialized in-home care. He loudly insisted to the neighbors that he and Tessa could handle everything. He conveniently ignored the undeniable fact that my mother sometimes lay unbathed for 2 days straight, or that she frequently missed critical, life-sustaining doses of her expensive heart medication because no one in the house was actually paying attention to the clock. I refused to let her rot in that stifling house just to protect his fragile, overblown pride. Since I could not openly challenge him without triggering a catastrophic, house-shaking rage that would only cause my mother more severe distress, I orchestrated her medical care entirely from the shadows. I quietly reached into my own corporate savings to hire a certified, highly trained night nurse. I paid a premium rate so my mother would not wake up terrified, gasping for air, and entirely alone in the dark at 3 a.m. I arranged for a private physical therapist to visit twice a week, strictly during the hours when my father was out inspecting his various construction sites. I purchased automated, tamper-proof medication dispensers that sent alerts directly to my phone. I even hired an independent financial specialist just to ensure my mother's personal utility bills and supplemental insurance premiums were not being carelessly tossed into the garbage along with the junk mail. I knew perfectly well that if Gabriel saw a personal check from me, or recognized a brightly marked medical agency van parked in his driveway, he would throw the caregivers out onto the front lawn. He would immediately accuse me of overstepping my boundaries and trying to emasculate him. To bypass his suffocating control and his explosive temper, I established a discreet, legally registered shell company. I named it Lark and Pine Family Services. I registered the limited liability company 2 states away, utilizing a professional registered agent so my name would never appear on the primary public registry. It sounded generic enough to be a boring local vendor, yet official enough to pass his casual, disinterested glance if he ever saw a billing envelope sitting on the kitchen counter. Lark and Pine Family Services became the invisible, impenetrable shield between my mother's basic survival and my father's raging ego. The actual nursing agency billed the shell company. I paid the agency out of my own pocket within 24 hours, and then, at my mother's strict, fiercely lucid insistence, I invoiced her secure personal account for the exact, penny-perfect cost of the services rendered. Those reimbursements were never gifts. They were never vague, unearned allowances. They were mathematically precise compensations backed by heavily itemized, legally binding invoices. Yet, those exact wire transfers are the very documents my father is currently waving around in this hostile courtroom. He and his theatrical lawyer have deliberately stripped away all the vital context. They erased the night nurses, the oxygen tank rentals, and the specialized dementia care, maliciously twisting those desperate medical lifelines into the hideous shape of a greedy daughter looting a sick woman's checking account. I had tried, on 4 separate, highly documented occasions during those 3 years, to formalize her care and protect her assets. I drafted comprehensive proposals to establish a transparent, legally binding, irrevocable care trust for my mother. I offered to fund the initial seed money myself, upwards of $10,000, just to get it started. I calmly explained that a trust would guarantee her medical needs were consistently met without putting any direct financial strain on the household accounts. Gabriel rejected the idea with a terrifying, vein-popping hostility. He literally threw the thick stack of legal documents across the kitchen floor, screaming that I was trying to steal his authority. I realized in that precise moment that his refusal had absolutely nothing to do with patriarchal pride, and everything to do with dark secrecy. He absolutely refused to let any outside trustee, lawyer, or independent auditor get a clear, unobstructed look at the internal cash flow of the Rivera household. He preferred his wife to suffer in agonizing pain rather than open his financial books to a stranger's scrutiny. Tessa, naturally, chose the path of least resistance. She enthusiastically chose to believe our father's twisted narrative because doing so completely absolved her of any heavy lifting or moral responsibility. If she accepted Gabriel's booming decree that I was a cold, meddling corporate snob trying to control their lives from afar, then her own willful ignorance became entirely justified. If I was the undisputed villain of the family, then Tessa did not have to ask the hard, uncomfortable questions. She did not have to ask why our mother was shivering in soiled sheets on a Tuesday afternoon, while Tessa sat in the living room watching television. She did not have to ask why the family emergency fund was suddenly severely depleted despite our father bringing in lucrative contracting jobs. Tessa built a comfortable, cozy shelter out of my father's lies. She played the exhausted, weeping caretaker for the neighborhood audience, while I secretly paid the actual professionals who kept our mother breathing. But Gabriel and Tessa made one massive, fatal miscalculation. They automatically assumed that because my mother's physical body was failing, her mind was entirely gone. They treated her like a piece of broken, obsolete furniture, constantly talking over her, making sweeping decisions for her, and slowly erasing her voice from her own home. Marian Rivera felt the walls closing in. She knew she was being systematically silenced. During her precious windows of sharp lucidity, usually in the quiet, early hours of the morning when the hired night nurse was sitting quietly nearby, my mother began to document her harsh reality. She filled small, wire-bound notebooks with her shaky, determined handwriting, hiding them meticulously beneath the heavy mattress pad where Tessa would never bother to look. She used a small digital voice recorder I had secretly slipped into her bedside drawer to capture brief, breathless audio memos. She chronicled her daily fears, her forced isolation, and her growing, terrifying suspicions about what her husband was truly doing with their money while she was confined to her bedroom. Absolutely no one in Belmere knows those recordings and hidden journals exist. Gabriel fully believes he successfully buried her truth the day he buried her heavy wooden casket. He genuinely believes he is the sole undisputed author of this family's history now. But as I sit here in this stifling, wood-paneled courtroom, listening to him rattle off the exact figures I supposedly stole, a cold, sharp, beautiful satisfaction settles over me. The plaintiff's attorney, Lowell Pike, has projected a highly magnified bank statement onto the large screen facing the jury. He dramatically circles a massive withdrawal with a thick red marker. He loudly proclaims to the room that I drained exactly $42,850 from my dying mother. He presents the enormous number as undeniable, smoking gun proof of my ruthless greed. I stare directly at that bold red circle, my expression entirely blank and unreadable. I do not flinch, because I know exactly what that specific number represents. That precise sum, down to the final, solitary dollar, aligns perfectly with the exact 8-week period when Marian Rivera suffered a massive secondary lung infection and required an emergency, round-the-clock respiratory specialist. My father is not just falsely accusing me of theft. He is inadvertently, publicly presenting the exact itemized receipt for the very life-saving care he adamantly, cruelly refused to provide. The dust had barely settled on my mother's grave, the funeral flowers still rotting on the damp earth, when my father unveiled his ultimate masterpiece. He gathered the entire extended family in the formal living room of the Elm Street house. Aunts, uncles, and cousins who had driven in from neighboring counties sat in uncomfortable silence, holding tepid cups of coffee. Gabriel stood by the large stone fireplace, clutching a thick cream-colored legal document as if it were a sacred text. It was a heavily redacted, carefully curated interpretation of my mother's final will and testament. With a voice trembling with perfectly manufactured grief, he announced to the room that I was entirely disinherited. His justification was a highly specific provision he loudly referred to as the Stable Employment Clause. He looked directly at my oldest aunt, shaking his head sorrowfully, and claimed that in her final days, my mother had wept over my shadowy, transient lifestyle. He spun a tragic narrative, insisting she had been utterly ashamed of my lack of a visible career, and deliberately wrote that clause to protect her legacy from being squandered by an aimless drifter. Tessa sat on the sofa, clutching a tissue, nodding silently as if bearing witness to a heartbreaking truth. Less than 2 weeks later, Lowell Pike officially filed the civil lawsuit. The legal complaint was a massive, 3-pronged spear aimed directly at my throat. First, it alleged that I fundamentally violated the employment clause, thereby rendering me legally ineligible for any portion of the estate. Second, it accused me of the systematic, malicious misappropriation of my mother's personal bank accounts while she was incapacitated. Third, it claimed my actions caused severe, quantifiable damage to the overall estate fund, demanding full financial restitution and heavy punitive damages. Lowell drafted the complaint with maximum theatricality, utilizing aggressive legal adjectives meant to paint me as a ruthless financial predator who preyed on a dying woman. He wanted to legally categorize me as a parasite. But Gabriel and his small-town lawyer made one crucial, catastrophic mistake. They automatically assumed I would simply cower in the face of dense legal jargon and public shaming. They assumed I would be too intimidated, or perhaps too overwhelmed by grief, to read the actual, unredacted source material. When my attorney obtained the complete, unedited estate file during the mandatory discovery phase, I sat in a quiet room and read every single line of my mother's actual will. The alleged stable employment clause did not say what my father claimed it said. It did not require me to hold a highly visible, traditional job with a public office, a local boss, and a company softball team. My mother had been incredibly specific in her language. The actual text required the beneficiary to demonstrate a real, legal, and verifiable contribution to society. She knew exactly what she was writing. She chose those precise words because she knew the highly confidential, hidden nature of my work. She was quietly protecting me, ensuring my inheritance could not be challenged simply because I lacked a public profile. My father and his lawyer had deliberately cherry-picked the vaguest interpretations, surgically removing the vital context. They twisted my mother's protective shield into a posthumous weapon, attempting to make her a hostile witness against her own daughter from beyond the grave. Most people in my position would have been blinded by a fiery, righteous rage. They would have stormed into Gabriel's house, screaming about the sheer indignity and cruelty of his lies. I did not do that. When I feel a trap snapping shut around me, my emotions completely detach. My vision narrows, my heart rate drops, and I look strictly at the cold mechanics of the snare. Sitting in the sterile conference room of my lawyer's office, surrounded by cardboard boxes, I began to cross-reference the mountain of paperwork Lowell Pike had proudly submitted to the court. It did not take long for the physical evidence to betray the grand lie. I possess a forensic eye, trained to spot the tiny fractures in a fabricated story. First, I noticed a distinct, jarring inconsistency in the late-stage addendum attached to the will. The page numbering at the bottom right corner skipped abruptly from page 4 directly to page 6. Yet, the sentence carrying over from the bottom of page 4 flowed perfectly, without grammatical interruption, into the top of page 6. Someone had manually removed a page containing unfavorable terms and hastily reprinted the rest of the document to force the text to align, but they foolishly forgot to correct the sequential numbering. Then, I dug deep into the financial disclosures. Among the towering stack of bank statements submitted to prove my supposed theft, there was a glaring chronological gap. The statements for the 2 months immediately preceding my mother's death were completely missing. They simply did not exist in the plaintiff's exhibit list, conveniently hiding the exact period when Gabriel made his own massive, questionable withdrawals. Finally, I found the billing invoice submitted by the handwriting expert Lowell had hired to invalidate my mother's signature on the medical care invoices. The expert had charged $600. The line item explicitly stated the fee was strictly for the visual analysis of a low-resolution digital scan sent via email. The expert had never even requested, let alone examined, the original wet ink signatures. This was not a tragic case of a grieving widower misunderstanding a complex legal trust. This was a deliberate, clumsy, and highly illegal fabrication. Someone had actively altered binding legal documents and intentionally suppressed vital financial records to frame me for a crime I did not commit. I slid the mismatched addendum, the incomplete bank statements, and the handwriting expert's damning invoice across the polished mahogany table to my attorney, Nora Keene. Nora is a sharp, fiercely intelligent litigator who rarely wastes words. She examined the flawed documents in absolute silence for 10 long minutes. When she finally looked up at me, there was a cold, predatory gleam in her dark eyes. I asked her if we should file an immediate motion to dismiss based on fraudulent evidence. Nora slowly shook her head, tapping a silver pen against the table. She told me we had to keep our cards pressed tightly against our chests. She explained that if we revealed the glaring discrepancies now, during the pre-trial phase, Lowell Pike would simply claim it was a regrettable clerical error. He would instantly withdraw the flawed documents, amend the filing, and find a new, cleaner angle of attack. Nora leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. She said we needed Gabriel to take the witness stand. We needed him to place his hand on a Bible in front of a live jury and swear, under the absolute penalty of perjury, that these specific documents were completely accurate and unedited. We had to let him securely lock himself inside his own burning building before we casually threw away the key. I agreed without a single second of hesitation. That is exactly why, sitting in the courtroom today, listening to him build his towering fortress of lies, I feel absolutely no fear. My father looks down at me from the witness stand and sees a ghost, a failure, a woman who brings absolutely nothing to the table. He has absolutely no idea what I actually do for a living when I leave the city limits of Belmere. He does not know that I have spent my entire adult life hunting arrogant men exactly like him. I do not just read spreadsheets. My entire profession revolves around dissecting massive, complex systems of fraud. I dismantle collapsed corporate empires fabricated by greedy insiders who thought they were smarter than the paper trail they left behind. My father thought he was setting a brilliant, inescapable trap for a helpless, ignorant daughter. He simply did not realize he was inviting a master architect of destruction into his own house. I do not carry a law enforcement badge, nor do I work for any federal intelligence agency. I am a senior director at the Blue Ledger Resolution Group. We are a private, highly specialized firm that steps into the chaotic aftermath of massive financial collapses. When a heavily leveraged hedge fund suddenly disintegrates amid whispers of embezzlement, or when a sprawling real estate portfolio declares an emergency bankruptcy that simply does not align with their reported revenue, the courts and the primary creditors call us. We are the financial autopsy technicians of the corporate world. My daily life revolves entirely around asset recovery, complex fraud tracing, and the aggressive restructuring of insolvent entities. I spend my days hunting down capital that arrogant, desperate people have desperately tried to bury. The plaintiff's attorney, Lowell Pike, spent a significant portion of his opening statement mocking my complete lack of a public footprint. He paced the courtroom floor, triumphantly declaring that my name yields absolutely zero results on a standard internet search. He presented my invisible digital existence as undeniable proof that I am a transient failure who contributes nothing to society. What Lowell Pike does not understand, and what my father is entirely ignorant of, is that my invisibility is not a sign of unemployment. It is a strict, non-negotiable contractual requirement of my profession. My work is governed entirely by ironclad non-disclosure agreements, federally sealed court records, and highly sensitive corporate litigation protocols. The multinational banks and the private equity boards who hire my firm pay us exorbitant fees precisely because we are invisible. They do not want their fragile shareholders or the aggressive media to know that a forensic investigator is quietly tearing through their internal ledgers. You will not find my photograph on a glossy corporate networking website, and you will never find a public list of the cases I have successfully managed. For the better part of 15 years, I have made a highly lucrative living strictly through the forensic analysis of distressed cash flows. My specific expertise lies in cross-referencing thousands of pages of redacted bank records, piercing the protective corporate veils of offshore dummy corporations, and aggressively exposing the gross abuse of fiduciary duties. I specialize in dismantling exactly the type of amateur, arrogant financial manipulation that my father is currently attempting to pull off in this very courtroom. I have sat in federal courtrooms across 4 different states, providing clinical expert testimony that successfully clawed back tens of millions of dollars hidden behind complex layers of fake vendor invoices and fraudulent property transfers. Therefore, when Lowell Pike stood in front of the local jury earlier today and smugly suggested that a person without a social media profile cannot possibly hold a real job, I did not feel a single ounce of humiliation. I only felt a profound, chilling sense of secondhand embarrassment for his staggering lack of sophistication. However, this absolute confidentiality is exactly what made me the perfect target for Gabriel's devastating smear campaign. My father is a man who measures a person's fundamental worth entirely by how loudly he can broadcast their achievements to his hunting buddies and his fellow church members. He values public glory above all else. Because I could not hand him a framed magazine article featuring my face, or a public municipal title he could casually drop into a conversation at the local diner. My career essentially did not exist in his reality. I was succeeding on a massive, high-stakes scale, but I was doing it in a shadowy, sophisticated world he could neither see nor comprehend. Because my professional life offered absolutely no material for his own public bragging, he found it incredibly easy to convince himself, and eventually the entire town of Belmere, that I was a complete failure hiding from the real world. But my mother knew the truth. Marion Rivera possessed a quiet, piercing intelligence that Gabriel frequently underestimated. She knew exactly what I did for a living, even if she did not fully grasp the intricate financial jargon of corporate restructuring. She knew my work was relentless, heavily guarded, and entirely real. That is exactly why she specifically instructed her independent legal counsel to utilize the phrase verifiable legal contribution instead of the standard, easily misconstrued visible employment when drafting that final protective clause in her will. She was extending a silent, legally binding hand from her sickbed to protect me. She knew Gabriel would eventually try to weaponize my quiet nature against me, so she deliberately chose vocabulary that would force a court to look at hard, undeniable financial evidence rather than mere local popularity. Looking back now, I realize that my strict adherence to professional restraint is exactly what allowed this horrific family nightmare to metastasize. Throughout the grueling 3 years of my mother's cognitive and physical decline, I deliberately chose to keep my mouth shut about the alarming financial discrepancies I was already beginning to notice in the household accounts. I saw the strange transfers, I noted the missing statements, but I did not want to turn my childhood home into an active fraud investigation while the woman I loved was actively dying in the bedroom down the hall. I desperately wanted her final months to be as peaceful as humanly possible, entirely free from the brutal, house-shaking screaming matches that would have inevitably erupted if I had formally audited my father's business accounts back then. I prioritized her immediate comfort over my own long-term security, but my dignified silence created a massive, dangerous vacuum. It gave Gabriel the exact, uninterrupted runway he needed to painstakingly construct a completely fabricated version of events that painted him as the exhausted saint and me as the calculating thief. I remember sitting in Nora Keene's immaculate office 2 days after Gabriel formally served me with the civil lawsuit. Nora looked at the mountain of fraudulent paperwork Lowell Pike had filed, then looked across the desk at me, her dark eyes narrowing in genuine curiosity. She asked me what hurt the most about this entire betrayal. She fully expected me to say it was the potential loss of a significant inheritance, or perhaps the deep, personal sting of being publicly sued by my own flesh and blood. I looked down at the clumsy forged signatures and the strategically missing bank statements resting on her mahogany table. I told her the money was entirely irrelevant. I told her the true agony, the thing that kept me awake at night, was Gabriel's staggering, breathtaking arrogance. The deepest insult was that my father truly believed that simply by throwing away my old academic awards, taking my photographs down from the hallway wall, and telling a few strategic lies to the local hardware store owner, he could fundamentally alter reality. He honestly believed that because he could easily manipulate a small town, he could outsmart the actual paper trail of his own crimes. He thought that if he successfully erased my public footprint, he could successfully erase the truth right along with it. That bitter realization crystallized my entire strategy for this trial. I am not going to take the witness stand and attempt to win a desperate popularity contest against Belmere's favorite former city councilman. I am not going to weep, raise my voice, or beg the jury to believe that I am a loving, dutiful daughter. I do not care if they like me. I do not care if they think I am cold, distant, or unfeeling. I am simply going to apply the exact same ruthless, uncompromising forensic methodology that I use on corrupt corporate executives every single day. I am going to meticulously, mathematically, and undeniably prove exactly how incredibly stupid and careless Gabriel Rivera was when he decided to fabricate a complex financial crime against an expert in dismantling financial crimes. He built a house of cards, and I am the wind. The air in the courtroom grew visibly thinner the moment Lowell Pike called his forensic handwriting expert to the stand. The walls felt as if they were slowly inching inward, designed to crush the remaining oxygen out of my lungs. The expert was a severe, bespectacled man who spoke with an unyielding, clinical authority. Pike dimmed the overhead lights and projected a massive, glaring image of my mother's signature onto the white wall facing the jury box. With a silver laser pointer, the expert traced the looping ink of the letter M and the sharp, descending angle of the letter R. He spoke to the 12 men and women in the box as if he were teaching a masterclass on deception. He confidently concluded that there were severe, undeniable signs of inconsistency in the signatures authorizing the financial reimbursements to my accounts. He pointed out jagged breaks in the pen strokes and a lack of fluid pressure, heavily implying that someone with a trembling, nervous hand had traced the letters. I sat perfectly still, my fingernails digging sharp half-moons into the palms of my hands. I knew the devastating truth behind that jagged ink. I knew that the expert's entire damning analysis was based on a heavily degraded fourth-generation photocopy. Even worse, the specific control samples Lowell Pike had provided to him were pulled from the absolute darkest period of my mother's illness, a specific window of time when she was prescribed heavy, debilitating doses of liquid morphine to manage her agonizing bone pain. Her hands were shaking violently from the narcotics, not from forgery, but the jury did not know about the medication timeline yet. They only heard a certified professional mathematically proving that I was a liar. The pressure intensified to a blinding degree when Tessa took the witness stand. If the handwriting expert was a clinical strike against my logic, my sister was a brutal, calculated strike against my humanity. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She spoke in a breathless, fragile whisper that forced the entire courtroom to lean forward, hanging on to her every tragic word. Tessa looked down at her folded hands and painted a vivid, agonizing picture of the physical toll of terminal illness. She described the excruciating process of bathing our frail mother, the countless hours spent grinding up bitter pills into applesauce, and the endless, terrifying nights she claimed she spent sleeping on the hard hardwood floor right next to the hospital bed. Then, she pivoted the spotlight directly onto me. Her voice hardened, just a fraction, dripping with a quiet, devastating resentment. Tessa testified that I was a ghost who only materialized when there was administrative paperwork to control. She told the jury that I vanished cyclically, disappearing for months at a time into my untouchable city life, entirely blind to the visceral horror of the sick room. When I did finally grace the family with my presence, she claimed, I marched through the front door wearing expensive wool coats, barking cold, detached orders as if my own father and sister were merely incompetent employees at one of my corporate firms. She painted herself as the bleeding, exhausted martyr, and she painted me as an arrogant, sterilized stranger who had absolutely no concept of what real, suffocating grief felt like. It was a flawless assassination of my character. I could feel the cold, hard stares of the jury boring into the side of my face. But the absolute peak of this suffocating onslaught arrived when Gabriel returned to the stand for redirect examination. Lowell Pike knew exactly how to extract the maximum amount of dramatic poison from his star witness. Pike paced slowly, allowing the silence to stretch until it was almost painful. Then, he stopped dead, looked Gabriel straight in the eye, and asked the ultimate question. He asked if Gabriel had ever, at any point during those agonizing 3 years, received a single penny of financial support from his eldest daughter to help with the crushing medical debts. Gabriel grabbed the edges of the wooden witness box. His knuckles turned stark white. His chest heaved with magnificent, theatrical outrage. He leaned into the microphone, his voice booming like thunder across the quiet room. He swore before God and everyone present that he had never seen a single cent. He vehemently stated that he had carried the crushing financial burden entirely alone, bleeding his own hard-earned business accounts dry to keep his wife comfortable. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at me and roared that I had completely fabricated the entire story of funding her care. He claimed I invented the night nurses and the medical equipment as a sick, elaborate fantasy to legitimize the tens of thousands of dollars I had ruthlessly stolen from a dying woman. To cement this devastating narrative, Pike wheeled out a row of massive, white foam core boards. They were poster-sized bank summaries, heavily redacted and manipulated for maximum visual trauma. Every single legitimate reimbursement transferred to my account had been highlighted in a thick, violently bright yellow marker. Without the crucial, corresponding medical invoices attached to explain them, the yellow lines looked exactly like a slaughter. They looked like a relentless, methodical gutting of my mother's life savings. A transfer of $4,000 here, a transfer of $8,000 there. The visual impact was instantaneous and catastrophic. I watched the faces in the jury box harden into stone. The woman in seat 4, the one whose son played on the baseball team Gabriel sponsored, actually shook her head in open disgust, refusing to even look in my direction anymore. The older man in seat 7 crossed his arms so tightly his shoulders hunched. They were no longer looking at a fellow citizen navigating a complex legal dispute. They were looking at a monster. They saw the exact stereotype they had been culturally conditioned to despise. The ungrateful, greedy child who abandons her roots, only to circle back like a vulture the moment there is a vulnerable estate to tear apart. I was completely boxed in, surrounded by a fortress of incredibly well-told lies. Any normal defense attorney would have been on their feet, shouting objections, demanding the exhibits be stricken, fighting desperately to break the suffocating momentum. But Nora Keene remained seated next to me, maddeningly calm. She did not raise her voice. She did not express a single ounce of outrage. When it was finally her turn to cross-examine, she approached the podium with a quiet, almost bored demeanor. She did not attempt to tear down their emotional narratives. She simply asked for absolute, chilling confirmations. She looked at Gabriel and asked if he was absolutely, unconditionally certain that the dates highlighted on the board represented pure theft. Gabriel practically snarled his confirmation. She asked Tessa to repeat, for the official court reporter, that she was the sole, exclusive caregiver during the months of October and November. Tessa confidently swore that she was. Nora methodically went down her yellow legal pad, securing their absolute sworn commitment to every single lie they had just told. She did not argue. She just gently guided them further out onto the incredibly thin ice, ensuring they had absolutely no plausible deniability left. The atmosphere in the courtroom felt like a complete, devastating defeat. The oxygen was gone. To everyone watching, including Lowell Pike, it appeared that my defense had completely collapsed under the sheer, undeniable weight of the plaintiff's evidence. But beneath the surface of my blank expression, my heart beat with a steady, calculated rhythm. The despair in the room was entirely by design. I was intentionally letting my father and my sister speak too confidently, letting them walk too far away from the safety of the shore. I needed them to build their towering, arrogant monument of perjury so high, and so publicly, that when the truth finally arrived to shatter the foundation, they would have absolutely nowhere to run. Nora Keene did not slam her hands on the heavy wooden podium. She did not raise her voice to a theatrical, echoing roar to object to the mountain of lies Lowell Pike had just built. She simply stood up, smoothed the front of her tailored gray jacket, and began the systematic, utterly bloodless dismantling of my father's kingdom. She started her counterattack with the smallest, most highly technical detail in the room. Nora approached the witness box holding a single, thin manila folder. She asked the plaintiff's bespectacled handwriting expert to state his hourly consulting fee for the court record. $350 an hour, the man stated proudly, adjusting his tie. Nora nodded slowly, as if genuinely impressed. She then asked him if, for that premium, top-tier fee, he had ever actually touched the original paper invoices he was testifying about. The man blinked, shifting his weight in the wooden chair. He admitted he had only received digital scans via electronic mail. Nora pressed further, her voice entirely conversational but razor-sharp. She asked how he scientifically measured the depth of the pen pressure, a universally recognized and crucial indicator of active forgery, from a flat, pixelated computer image. The expert swallowed hard, glancing at Lowell Pike, and stammered that he could not. Finally, Nora handed the expert a thick stack of old birthday cards and joint tax returns. She asked if the plaintiff's attorney had provided these specific, verified signature samples, all dated 2 years prior to my mother's heavy morphine prescriptions, for his comparative analysis. The expert looked at the steady, fluid ink on the old cards, then looked down at his lap. He quietly answered no. In exactly 4 minutes, Nora completely neutralized the expensive, intimidating expert without ever raising her voice above a polite murmur. When it was my turn to face the cross-examination, I did not offer the jury a tearful, desperate monologue to win their sympathy. I gave them pure, undeniable arithmetic. Nora placed the heavily highlighted foam boards of my supposed thefts back on the easel facing the jury box, but this time, she placed a second, identical board right next to it. For every single bright yellow withdrawal my father claimed was a malicious theft, Nora produced a corresponding, fully itemized medical receipt. On the 12th of October, my father claimed I drained exactly $2,460. Nora displayed a cleared invoice for 24 hours of emergency respiratory care, billed on the 11th of October for exactly $2,460. On the 3rd of November, Pike had highlighted a withdrawal of $890. The corresponding receipt Nora pinned to the board showed an emergency, late-night delivery of a specialized oxygen compressor to the Elm Street address. Then, Nora displayed a heavily documented series of printed electronic communications. Lowell Pike had fiercely argued that Lark and Pine Family Services was a phantom, sinister entity I operated from my towering city office to blindly funnel cash out of the estate. Nora presented the digital routing logs and telecommunication records. She definitively proved that every single request for extra night nursing shifts, every demand for imported pain medication, and every schedule adjustment sent to Lark and Pine had originated directly from the registered landline telephone sitting on the kitchen counter of my parents' house. My mother had made the calls herself. Whenever Nora or Pike asked me a direct question on the stand, I answered with the cold, unyielding precision of a metronome. I did not tell long, winding stories. I recited the exact dates of service. I recited the precise times of day. I gave the full legal names of the attending nurses, the primary care physicians, and the medical delivery drivers. I listed the daily medication administration logs purely from memory. I offered the hostel room an avalanche of undeniable, verifiable reality that shattered their emotional narrative. Next, Nora turned her surgical attention back to my younger sister. Tessa had sworn under oath that she was a penniless, exhausted martyr, utilizing our mother's secondary checking account strictly to purchase mundane medical supplies, nutritional shakes, and heating pads. Nora approached the witness box and gently placed a stack of glossy credit card statements directly in front of Tessa. She asked my sister to clearly explain a transaction dated the 14th of December for $650 at a high-end suburban designer boutique. She asked Tessa to explain the recurring $90 charges at a luxury nail salon in the neighboring county, all paid directly from the account she claimed was sacredly reserved for our dying mother. Tessa's face flushed a deep, mottled crimson. She gripped the microphone, her knuckles turning stark white, and stammered that she had needed a small mental break, that caring for a sick parent was incredibly stressful, and she deserved a minor personal comfort. The carefully crafted image of the selfless, suffering saint shattered instantly. She did not look like a martyr anymore. She looked exactly like a terrified, spoiled child, caught with her hand deep inside the cash register. But the most devastating, earth-shattering blow was reserved exclusively for Gabriel. Nora displayed a massive bank withdrawal of $18,000. Earlier in the trial, my father had boldly testified under oath that this specific withdrawal was used for a critical emergency roof repair to keep the drafty house warm for his failing wife. Nora then projected the certified corporate banking records of Stone Harbor Grading, my father's private land development company. On the exact same day, the $18,000 left my mother's personal account. A deposit of exactly $18,000 appeared in the Stone Harbor business ledger. There was never a broken roof. There were never any roofers at the house. He had quietly cannibalized his dying wife's remaining liquid assets to cover a massive, embarrassing financial shortfall in his own failing business. The final, brutal twist of the knife came when Nora addressed the core, underlying issue of financial manipulation. Lowell Pike had spent 2 days painting me as the sole manipulative shadow, pulling the administrative strings of the household. Nora calmly presented a bank authorization form dated exactly 6 months before my mother passed away. It was a formal, notarized request to add a secondary, completely unrestricted signatory to my mother's completely separate, private savings account. The name printed on the approved authorization form was not mine. It was Gabriel Rivera. My father erupted. He lost his mind entirely. He slammed both of his heavy, calloused fists down on the wooden railing of the witness stand. The loud, violent crack echoed off the high ceiling, making 2 of the jurors physically jump in their seats. He screamed that he was her husband. He roared at the top of his lungs that he was legally entitled to control the household finances, that every single penny in that house belonged to him by right, and that his wife had voluntarily handed over the reins because she was far too weak and confused to manage it herself. His face was a dark, dangerous purple, twisted with unhinged rage. He was spitting his words, pointing violently at Nora, then at the judge, and finally at me. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I sat with my hands folded neatly on the defense table, my posture perfectly straight, my expression completely void of any readable emotion. Against his explosive, sweating, desperate fury, my absolute, dead calm stillness spoke volumes. His loud shouting did not sound like the righteous, justified anger of a wronged patriarch defending his family. It sounded exactly like the panicked, pathetic flailing of a tyrant whose absolute power had just been violently stripped away in public. The jury watched him completely unravel, their previous hostility toward me evaporating, replaced by wide-eyed shock and a dawning, horrifying realization of who they were actually dealing with. Nora waited patiently, her hands clasped behind her back, for his screaming to echo into silence. The courtroom became so terrifyingly quiet, you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents in the ceiling. She turned slowly to the judge. She stated that while these glaring financial discrepancies clearly proved a pattern of perjury and theft, the most crucial, foundational piece of exculpatory evidence had not yet been presented to the court. Lowell Pike jumped to his feet, his face pale, demanding to know what she was talking about. He insisted loudly that his team had meticulously reviewed every single piece of discovery material during the pretrial phase. Nora looked at the plaintiff's table with a faint, chilling smile that did not reach her eyes. She informed the court that the plaintiff could not have possibly reviewed it, because the evidence in question was currently sitting inside a heavily restricted, federally sealed legal file. It was a file my father had absolutely no idea even existed. Up until this exact moment in the trial, Judge Adrian Vale had been a perfectly silent, almost invisible presence on the elevated bench. When the civil suit was first filed, every local judge in Belmere County had immediately filed recusal motions. They all knew my father. They had eaten his catered barbecue at the summer festivals, sat in the pews he helped fund, and accepted his generous campaign contributions. The state had been forced to bring in an outside judge to preside over the case. Gabriel had been visibly thrilled by this development. He looked at Judge Vale, a quiet, unassuming man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, and saw a completely blank slate. My father assumed Vale was just a tired, traveling bureaucrat who would easily be swayed by the overwhelming local support sitting in the gallery. For the first 2 days, Vale had done nothing to correct that assumption. He rarely interrupted Lowell Pike. He took notes with a heavy black fountain pen and maintained a neutral, almost bored expression. But the absolute second Nora uttered the words regarding a sealed federal file, the entire atmosphere around the bench shifted. Judge Vale did not slam his gavel or shout. He simply stopped writing. He placed the cap back onto his fountain pen with a sharp, audible click that echoed across the silent room. He folded his hands together and leaned forward, looking down at the plaintiff's table. The questions that began to flow from Judge Vale were not standard procedural inquiries. They were the highly specialized, surgical strikes of someone who deeply understood the dark, complex mechanics of elder financial abuse. He bypassed the emotional theatrics entirely. He looked directly at Lowell Pike and asked where the original, wet-ink copies of the bank transfer authorizations were physically located. He demanded to know exactly who held the primary digital access codes to my mother's separate accounts during her final year. He asked a chillingly precise question about the secondary signer authorization, inquiring if the Internet Protocol address used to submit the digital request belonged to my mother's tablet or my father's desktop computer in his home office. Finally, he asked who exactly had selected the handwriting expert, and whether that expert had ever been disciplined for providing unverified remote testimony in previous county cases. Gabriel shifted heavily in his chair, his face contorting into a mask of deep, ugly irritation. This was not how things worked in his world. When Gabriel Rivera spoke, local authorities were supposed to nod sympathetically and ask how they could help him. He tried to lock eyes with the judge, attempting to project the formidable, dominant aura that usually made the Belmere Zoning Board fold in minutes. But Judge Vale did not care about the size of my father's contracting business or his standing in the local church. Vale stared back with eyes as cold and flat as slate. For the very first time in his life, my father was sitting across from a man of authority who could not be charmed, bought, or intimidated by his small-town reputation. Sensing the catastrophic shift in the room's power dynamic, Lowell Pike sprang into a desperate, frantic counteroffensive. He practically leaped out of his chair, waving his hands in the air to break the suffocating tension. Pike aggressively objected to any further mention of a sealed file. He raised his voice, adopting his most theatrical tone of righteous indignation. He told the court that the defense was engaging in a pathetic, desperate fishing expedition. Pike argued that because I possessed absolutely no public credibility and no real evidence to defend myself, my lawyer was simply inventing a phantom document to confuse the 12 honest citizens in the jury box. He demanded that the judge strike the mention of the sealed record from the official transcript and aggressively sanction Nora for attempting to derail a straightforward civil matter. Judge Vale did not even blink at the outburst. He looked at Pike the way a scientist observes a loud, entirely irrelevant insect. He calmly overruled the objection, stating that his courtroom was not a theater for cheap misdirection. He then turned his undivided attention back to my attorney. He asked Nora to state, for the record, the exact legal basis and the specific statute that would justify opening a restricted file in the middle of a civil inheritance dispute. Nora stood perfectly straight. She did not rush her words. She knew she was delivering the final, fatal dose of poison to Gabriel's fabricated empire. She informed the court that exactly 8 months before Marion Rivera passed away, an independent legal counsel had formally filed a petition for the protection of a vulnerable adult's personal assets. Nora explained that the petition included a highly detailed preliminary forensic audit conducted by a neutral third party. That audit traced the alarming, unexplained hemorrhage of funds from my mother's accounts into various failing business entities. Nora paused, letting the silence ring in the ears of everyone present. Then, she delivered the killing blow. She stated that the petition and the audit had been strictly sealed by a state magistrate for one highly specific reason. The magistrate had determined that the primary caregiver, Gabriel Rivera, posed a significant, immediate risk of psychological retaliation. The documents were sealed to prevent the husband from discovering the investigation and inflicting further emotional or physical distress upon a dying, highly vulnerable patient. A collective, sickening gasp rippled through the wooden pews of the gallery. I watched the faces of the jury members physically change, the final pieces of the puzzle locked into place behind their eyes. The illusion of the grieving, devoted widower shattered into a million irreparable pieces. They suddenly understood that this entire, elaborate civil lawsuit was never about recovering stolen inheritance money. It was a massive, preemptive strike. Gabriel had sued me, publicly dragging my name through the mud, solely to completely discredit me before I could unseal that damning audit and expose his crimes to the world. He was trying to burn the messenger before the message could be delivered. I turned my head slightly to look at my father. The transformation was absolutely breathtaking. The towering, arrogant patriarch of Belmere was entirely gone. In his place sat an old, terrified man whose skin had turned the color of spoiled milk. His mouth hung open slightly, but no words came out. He looked completely paralyzed. For a man whose entire existence revolved around absolute control, the realization that his frail, bedridden wife had secretly outsmarted him was completely destroying his mind. There was a hidden chapter of his wife's life that he had not seen. There was a permanent legal record of his abuse that he could not rip off a hallway wall. He could not shred it. He could not lie about it to his hunting buddies. And he could not force Tessa to cover it up. He was entirely exposed, naked and shivering under the bright, unforgiving fluorescent lights of the courtroom. The heavy, oppressive silence stretched on for what felt like 10 full minutes. No one dared to cough or shuffle their papers. Every single eye in the room was fixed firmly on the elevated bench. Judge Adrian Vale looked down at the courtroom, his eyes sweeping slowly over Lowell Pike's panicked face, past Tessa's trembling shoulders, and finally coming to rest on my father's terrified expression. He held Gabriel's gaze for a very long time, offering absolutely no comfort, no sympathy, and no escape. Then, Judge Vale reached out and pulled the small microphone closer to his face. He spoke one single, measured sentence that completely altered the trajectory of our lives. He announced that he would recess the court for exactly 48 hours to personally review the sealed file in his private chambers, and he would seriously consider lifting the restrictions to enter it into the public record. When the court reconvened exactly 48 hours later, the 12 leather chairs in the jury box remained entirely empty. Judge Adrian Vale had ordered an evidentiary hearing behind closed doors, strictly excluding the jury until he could determine the admissibility of the newly unsealed federal file. The atmosphere inside the room was no longer just tense. It was completely suffocating. Gabriel sat slumped at the plaintiff table, his usual commanding posture replaced by the rigid, trembling stance of a cornered animal. Nora Keene walked to the center of the floor. She did not bring a towering stack of visual aids this time. She held only a slender, gray folder. She began to speak, her voice echoing in the hollow space, methodically dismantling the grand illusion of the Rivera household. She revealed that nearly a full year before her passing, my mother had proactively, secretly contacted an independent legal advocate. Marion had noticed significant sums of money quietly vanishing from her personal savings. When she had asked her husband about the shrinking balances, she was aggressively dismissed. She was told she was simply confused, that her medication was clouding her memory, and that nothing was out of the ordinary. She was being systemically gaslit in her own bed. Nora opened the gray folder and laid out the 3 distinct components of the previously sealed file. First, there was a formal legal petition for a restricted review of assets. Second, there was a sworn, detailed letter from my mother's primary neurologist. This medical document explicitly confirmed that while Marion suffered from physical decline, her cognitive function remained sharply intact during specific, documented windows of the day. The doctor explicitly warned that her extreme physical dependence made her highly susceptible to undue influence and emotional coercion by her primary caregiver. The third component was the truly devastating weapon. It was a preliminary forensic audit conducted by an independent certified public accountant named Dana Holt. Nora read directly from the executive summary. The audit did not yet accuse Gabriel of outright, violent theft. Instead, it meticulously mapped out a classic, undeniable model of soft misappropriation. Dana Holt had tracked a very specific pattern of financial grooming. Money would leave my mother's secure personal accounts under the guise of general household maintenance. It would briefly cycle through a joint checking account to blend in with legitimate grocery and utility expenses. Then, almost immediately, massive, clean sums would be wired directly into the failing corporate accounts of Stone Harbor Grading. My father was using his dying wife as an unregulated, interest-free corporate bailout fund. But the cold, hard numbers were not the climax of Nora's presentation. She approached the bench and handed a small, encrypted digital drive to the court clerk. Nora informed the judge that alongside the audit, my mother had left behind a sworn, recorded legal video. It was captured on a day when her mind was perfectly clear and her pain was entirely managed. In the description of the video, Nora stated that my mother explicitly voiced her deepest, darkest terror. Marion believed that the agonizing delay in her professional medical care was not a matter of my father's misplaced pride. She terrifiedly suspected that her rapidly deteriorating health was being deliberately prolonged and utilized as a convenient smokescreen to cover up his aggressive draining of her life savings. The moment the word video left Nora's mouth, Lowell Pike sprang up from his chair as if he had been physically burned. He practically shouted his objections. His face flushed a deep, panicked red. He desperately argued that allowing a video of a deceased, heavily medicated woman to be played would be overwhelmingly and unfairly prejudicial to his client. He claimed the video was textbook hearsay, an unverified digital file lacking proper cross-examination, and that it was entirely inadmissible under state evidentiary rules. Gabriel nodded frantically beside him, his eyes wide and silently pleading with the man sitting on the elevated bench. Judge Adrian Vale was not moved by the frantic, emotional flailing of a small-town attorney. He sat back in his large leather chair and steepled his fingers, watching Pike sweat. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was incredibly quiet, yet it carried the undeniable, crushing weight of absolute authority. He pointed out that he had spent the last 48 hours carefully reviewing the plaintiff's original financial submissions alongside the newly unsealed preliminary audit. He did not need to scream to make his point. His language was surgically precise. Judge Vale noted that the specific way the plaintiff's bank records had been manually spliced, the exact chronological gaps where the statements were missing, and the aggressive utilization of a secondary signature authorization were not novel tactics. He looked directly at Gabriel and stated that these were the highly predictable, textbook maneuvers of familial financial manipulation. He recognized the pattern intimately. While he agreed that playing the entire, highly emotional video for the jury might cross the line into prejudicial territory without further authentication, he completely rejected Pike's attempt to bury the truth. Judge Vale formally ruled that he would admit the specific, limited portions of the video and the audit that directly addressed the exact source of the funds I was currently being accused of stealing. The truth of the reimbursements was going to be entered into the permanent public record. I sat at the defense table, my breathing slow and entirely controlled. I knew the battle was turning massively in my favor, but my professional instincts kept me hyper-vigilant. The war was not completely won yet. We were incredibly close to the finish line, but Gabriel Rivera was a master manipulator with decades of practice. If we did not deliver a catastrophic, indisputable final blow, there was still a dangerous, lingering chance he could survive this. I knew exactly how his mind worked. I could already see him planning his next public relations campaign. If he was allowed to leave this room with even a shred of his dignity intact, he would stand on the steps of the courthouse and tell the entire town of Belmere that his wealthy, sophisticated city daughter had simply hired expensive lawyers to fabricate a complex, confusing financial file to cover up her own terrible crimes. He would twist the narrative, playing the simple, overwhelmed country contractor bullied by corporate elites. We could not just beat him. We had to completely, utterly annihilate his credibility so that no one in this town would ever believe a single word he said again. The court clerk signaled that the jury was lined up in the hallway, waiting to be brought back into the room for the final phase of the trial. Judge Vale nodded, instructing the bailiff to open the heavy oak doors. But just before the bailiff could turn the brass handle, the judge raised his hand, halting the entire proceeding. The room fell into a deathly frozen silence. Judge Adrian Vale leaned forward, resting his forearms on the polished mahogany of the bench. He bypassed Lowell Pike entirely and locked his piercing gaze directly onto my father. Gabriel physically shrank under the weight of that stare, his broad shoulders collapsing inward. Judge Vale looked down at the man who had confidently swaggered into his courtroom 3 days ago, believing he owned the entire world. In a voice as sharp and cold as freshly broken glass, the judge decided to explain exactly why Gabriel's grand manipulative plan was doomed the very second he filed the paperwork. He decided to tell my father exactly why. Out of every single magistrate in the entire state, he was the absolute worst possible man to try and deceive. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the 12 jurors filed back into the courtroom, taking their seats in absolute silence. The air was thick, charged with the kind of static electricity that precedes a massive storm. Judge Adrian Vale waited until the final juror was seated before he leaned into his microphone. He did not look at my lawyer. He did not look at Lowell Pike. He fixed his gaze entirely on the 12 men and women in the box, and then, deliberately, shifted it to my father. Judge Vale began to speak, his voice calm, resonant, and entirely stripped of any judicial detachment. He informed the jury that before he was appointed to the bench, he had spent 15 years as the head of the state's specialized task force prosecuting elder financial abuse and fiduciary fraud within families. He stated plainly that he had spent his entire career watching arrogant husbands, greedy children, and manipulative guardians utilize the exact same predictable, pathetic playbook. They systematically isolate the vulnerable patient. They aggressively obscure the household cash flow. And when the walls finally begin to close in, they invariably project their own crimes onto the single person in the family who demands transparency. I watched Gabriel's chest freeze. This was the ultimate, devastating irony. When the local magistrates recused themselves because of his overwhelming, suffocating influence in Belmere, Gabriel thought the legal system had handed him a miraculous gift. He thought he was getting a tired, ignorant outsider who would be easily dazzled by a packed gallery and a few well-placed tears. He had absolutely no idea who he was dealing with. Out of the hundreds of judges in this state, my father had managed to drag his fabricated case directly into the courtroom of the foremost expert in his exact brand of domestic financial terror. The judge then ordered the clerk to play the admitted portions of the encrypted video file. The large screens facing the jury flickered to life. My mother's face appeared. She looked fragile, her skin pale against the pillows, but her eyes were crystal clear, burning with a quiet, desperate intensity. The courtroom held its collective breath. Marian Rivera spoke directly into the camera, her voice weak, but completely unwavering. She stated, for the permanent, undeniable record, that her eldest daughter Stella had never stolen a single penny from her. She calmly explained that every financial transfer was a direct, requested reimbursement for specialized medical care that her husband absolutely refused to authorize. Then, my mother delivered the most heartbreaking truth of all. She confessed that she was the one who explicitly ordered me to maintain a physical distance, begging me to handle her care from the shadows simply to avoid triggering my father's violent, house-shaking tantrums. But Marian did not stop at my exoneration. She looked straight into the lens and issued a devastating warning from beyond the grave. She stated that she was terrified her husband was secretly commingling her personal life savings to desperately bail out his failing land development company. She instructed the camera, and whoever might be watching in the future, that if Stella was ever falsely accused of financial impropriety, the authorities needed to immediately subpoena the corporate ledgers of Stone Harbor Grading. Gabriel looked as if all the blood had been violently drained from his body. He slumped back into his chair, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The jury stared at the screen, utterly mesmerized, watching a dead woman systematically dismantle her husband's entire life, before Lowell Pike could even attempt to recover. Nora called Dana Holt, the independent forensic auditor, to the witness stand, Dana did not offer emotional opinions. She offered cold, hard math. She presented the fully unsealed report to the jury, tracking the exact flow of every single missing dollar. She testified that during the final 36 months of Marion Rivera's life, well over $200,000 had been systematically bled from her secure personal accounts. Dana traced the routing numbers, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the vast majority of that money never went toward oxygen tanks, pain management, or home nurses. Instead, massive, regular infusions of cash were funneled directly into Gabriel's failing business to cover payroll shortages, heavy equipment leases, and overdue municipal taxes. Sitting in the second row of the gallery, Tessa completely unraveled. Throughout the trial, she had clung to the delusion that she was the innocent, martyred caretaker, genuinely believing her father's lies because it kept her comfortable. But as Dana Holt listed the specific dates and the exact routing numbers of the drained accounts, Tessa's eyes widened in absolute horror. She realized, with crushing clarity, that the accounts Gabriel had been looting were the exact same accounts she had been using to pay for her luxury shopping sprees, her expensive dinners, and her brand new car. The blood money had funded her silence. Tessa shot up from her wooden bench. Ignoring the bailiff's stern warning, she pointed a shaking finger directly at the back of Gabriel's head, her voice cracking into a hysterical sob. She screamed that she did not know, that he had told her the money was entirely separate and that she was only following his instructions. She threw him under the bus without a single second of hesitation to save her own skin. The impenetrable, arrogant alliance between the righteous father and the devoted younger daughter completely shattered right there in the middle of the courtroom, collapsing into a pathetic display of mutual betrayal. I looked at the 12 faces in the jury box. The transformation was complete. They no longer saw a cold, corporate vulture from the city who had returned to pick the bones of a dying woman. They saw the devastating truth. They realized I was the only person in that entire house who had quietly, consistently paid to keep Marion Rivera breathing. I was the only one who had sacrificed my own reputation to protect my mother's dignity from being crushed in a public, humiliating war. When the legal dust finally settled, the climax was swift and entirely merciless. Given the staggering, undeniable weight of the forensic evidence and the perjury committed on the stand, Judge Vale outright dismissed Gabriel's entire lawsuit with extreme prejudice. He did not stop there. He immediately ruled in favor of my aggressive countersuit for defamation and tortious interference with my inheritance, but the financial penalty was the least of my father's problems. Judge Vale formally referred the complete, unsealed audit, along with the undeniable evidence of Gabriel's fraudulent corporate transfers, directly to the State Attorney General's office for a full, separate criminal investigation into felony elder abuse and tax fraud. Gabriel Rivera, the towering, untouchable pillar of Belmere, was going to face the very real prospect of a state penitentiary. As for my mother's remaining estate, the court immediately stripped Gabriel of all fiduciary power. The remaining assets were placed under a strict, independent oversight mechanism. I agreed to participate alongside a court-appointed trustee, not because I desperately needed my mother's money, but because I needed to ensure my father never touched another dime of it. I stood up from the defense table and gathered my files. I did not look back at Gabriel as he sat paralyzed in his chair, completely destroyed by the very system he thought he could manipulate. I walked out of the heavy oak doors of the courtroom and stepped into the bright, blinding afternoon sun. I had not shed a single tear. I had not screamed. I had simply used the truth to burn his kingdom to the ground, and in doing so, I had finally given my mother her voice back. Thank you all so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let me know your city or country so we can connect and share our thoughts on this crazy journey. If you enjoyed this, please make sure to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, leave a like on the video, and support me even more by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by as many people as possible.